Why is it so difficult? Like now we mentioned, yes, we're getting out this information. People are becoming more educated, but it still seems, and I don't know, Renee, you tell me what you see, but it's still very difficult for the adult child then to recognize this, right? In their parents, like even as they survived, I think it's fair to call this like narcissistic abuse, right?
Right.
So
Right.
they survived it. Yeah, please. Hmm.
So yeah, they survived it and they moved on, and now they're in a relationship, maybe starting to question the dynamics of that relationship. A lot of times is where the light bulbs start coming on. Their learned behavior of how to tap dance around this parent's emotions starts playing out in their marriage, for
Oh,
example. And so the reflection starts of, okay, why am I feeling like, I've got to always not control, I've got to always care for their mood. I've always got to give. I've got to people please. Where did this people pleasing come from? And
mm,
so they start to explore that. Now, I want to say here that recognizing that a parent has been abusive is incredibly difficult for someone to look at, to explore, to consider. And I want to make sure our listeners understand that even if you look back and you go, man, I think my parents were abusive here, it doesn't mean you have to hate them. It doesn't mean you have to go no contact. It doesn't change anything, but it can help you to understand where your learned behaviors have come from.
hmm.
And so it's work that needs to be done. But when you look back at your parents, it's okay to still love them. It's okay to still care about them. It's then actually helps you to be able to set healthier boundaries with them, because the boundaries then can be, the boundaries are for you. And we'll talk about that maybe here in a little bit. But I just want people to understand, I'm not encouraging everybody to go no contact with their parents.
Hmm.
That's not what this is about. This is about learning how the impact of maybe your parents' trauma, because maybe it came from their childhood, how that carried over into you, so that we can stop this generational cycle that's going on through so many families.
Yeah, that's a relief to hear because so often the recommendation, in the social media content is usually just boundaries or get away from them, go no contact. And yes, we'll definitely get to that because I'm very interested to hear more about once you recognize this. So you've described the behaviors and then you begin to recognize them in your parent, right? It's
Mhm.
like, okay, it's still, is it still hurtful? Does it get to the point where it's not as hurtful? What do you do then if you decide not to go no contact, right? So you still have a
Right,
life with them. You still may go on vacation with them. And then the
right.
question becomes, and then like you said, you're a grown adult, so you may have your own spouse and your own children. We're getting further ahead in development here, but I'm just imagining what the nature of that relationship would look like. Would it look any different? How would you
Mhm.
feel? But I guess before we get into all that, you're touching on one other thing, which I just want to sort of flush out a little bit more before we press forward, which is so when you grow up with this type of parent, I guess what I'm wondering is you began to mention you may see this in your own relationship now as an adult. Could you maybe flush that out a little bit more? Like what might you begin to see as an adult in your own relationship that theoretically, right, is separate from your relationship with your parents? But I think what I'm beginning to hear, Renee, and correct me if I'm wrong, is it may not be that different because you're carrying something forward in your contemporary relationship.
Absolutely. And that is a lot of what happens. And so I want to take a minute and look at two of the manipulative tactics of a covert narcissistic parent
Hmm.
that seem to be, I want to look at two manipulative tactics of a covert narcissistic parent that I think is part of the reason why it's so difficult to see it, but it is also part of what, like, forms our behavior that carries forward into future relationships. Okay.
Hmm.
Those two behaviors or tactics are the intermittent reinforcement and the push and pull relationship.
Hmm.
So, intermittent reinforcement as a parent to child is where maybe you're praised one day, but you're criticized the very next
Hmm.
for the same behavior.
Mm.
The same behavior can get, you're so obedient and I'm so glad you listened to me when maybe you were just quiet at a mealtime, while they were visiting with their friend. And so you just know, okay, good. As a child, I learned I need to keep my mouth shut in this situation. Hey, I really appreciate how quiet you were and obedient. But the very next day, the same thing occurs, and now they're reprimanding you. Well, you never say anything. You should speak up more. So the inconsistency there,
Mm-hmm.
okay, lays a foundation of anxiety. It lays this foundation of, I never know, is my behavior good enough? Is it not good enough? And so we start questioning this, all right? That carries forward into my future relationship where I can't judge whether my behavior was good or bad. I've got to have feedback in order to do that. Well, as an adult, I should be able to identify right from wrong. I should be able to validate my own experiences, but that's a piece that gets missed
Mm-hmm.
when you're raised with a covert narcissistic parent.
Wait,
Okay.
let's dwell on that just for 1 second. So, as an adult, you said, let's repeat that. You should be able, you said at some point, to figure out what I feel like internally, I guess, is right and wrong. Is that what you mentioned, Renee?
Yes, moving into adulthood, that's part of our maturing process.
Okay. And something, I guess, has to happen to get to that place. Is that right? Like, what? I guess I'm wondering, because so many of these adult children don't have that capacity, so they're
Mhm.
still very dependent, I'm imagining now, still on the parent perhaps, and now on the spouse as well. Is that right?
Right. So from their parent's perspective, or from the child to the parent,
Mm-hmm.
adult child, they're still seeking that parent's validation. You
Mm.
move into adulthood and you're still trying to grasp that parent's approval.
Yes.
And so you're still struggling to figure out, how do I get that approval? Well, now in your marriage, you kind of play the same thing tends to play out.
Mm-hmm.
Now I'm looking at my spouse, whether this be husband or wife, whatever, wherever we are with that. I'm looking at my spouse for validation that I'm doing okay. And so we
Mm.
struggle to make that transition into self validation
Yes, I
of the
see.
maturing process of knowing. And so this is why I think it's so crucial that we get this information out,
Mm-hmm.
is so that people can find the help that they need to be able to make that maturing process happen.